I really hate the rain. Sitting in the car, I watched the raindrops hitting the windshield and heard them banging on the roof. It was not a light summer rain but a torrential downpour. When the wind picked up, I saw streams of water flooding the parking lot. It wasn't exactly a hurricane, but it resembled the dramatic news that was shown on TV. The installation of an air conditioner on the roof of the Heritage Cottage buffet had to be postponed until the rain subsided. I had no intention of going up to the roof to do any work until the weather improved. Besides, I shouldn't have been there at all. Wednesday was designated for work in Allentown, but when an emergency arose, I was the only one suitable for the job. No one else wanted to go on a service call, especially to the Heritage Cottage buffet at the York Holiday House Motel. Despite the old design with exterior entrances, the motel compensated for this with affordable prices. The restaurant is more popular than the hotel. At the moment, most of the guests were leaving, and the maids huddled under a canopy near the building to avoid getting wet from the rain. The wait seemed endless and boring until a beige Volkswagen convertible parked nearby caught my attention. From where I was standing, I couldn't make out the license plate, but it turned out to be identical to my wife's car. Amanda and I had been married for almost 2 decades and had 2 daughters, Colleen, who had just turned 18 and was preparing to start full-time studies at Kutztown University in 3 months, and Brenda, who had recently turned 16 and was completely immersed in rebellion. 2 complete opposites. Even though Amanda went to the same school, I didn't really get to know her until later when she worked as a waitress at a nearby diner. High school was not a joyful time for me. For as long as I can remember, I've been struggling with severe stuttering, and the teenage stress that accompanied it was unbearable. I was withdrawn and sullen, spoke only when absolutely necessary, and used as few words as possible. The teachers asked not to call on me in class, although I can't say if it made me feel better or worse. Many of my classmates thought I had dementia, but I never thought so because I didn't have any comparisons. Despite my calm demeanor, I always understood when I was being mistreated or bullied. Sometimes I had to resort to physical measures to put an end to some forms of bullying, and it always proved effective. I was just taking a technical course on air conditioning maintenance when I finally crossed paths with Amanda. Our first meeting happened when she was taking my order at the diner, and it turned out to be the only time we talked throughout high school. I didn't date anyone because of my lack of social skills. For several weeks, I just ordered food, ate, and left, always leaving a good tip to the team who were unfailingly polite and pleasant. Despite my nervousness, I felt comfortable in her presence, which required a lot of courage from me. After a while, I plucked up the courage and asked her out on a date, to which she gladly agreed. She wasn't bothered by the fact that during our conversations I mostly listened to her. When I spoke briefly and to the point. Despite knowing about my speech impediment, she never brought up the subject. Over the course of several months, our relationship developed and became more intimate. It was obvious that I lacked experience, but she was patient and understanding. She guided us through the process without embarrassment, clearly experienced in this area. I didn't feel the need to pry into her past because it was her personal business, not mine. After I graduated from technical college, we had a simple wedding ceremony. I got a job with a higher salary than I expected, and Amanda continued to work at the diner until Colleen was born. From that moment on, she devoted herself entirely to the role of wife and mother. Although we weren't rich, we lived comfortably, and life was good. Despite the heavy rain, out of curiosity, I tried to read the license plate on the Beetle. A silver Mercedes stopped next to the Beetle, and a man got out with an umbrella in his hands. I was amazed at how effectively he handled the rain. He walked over to the Volkswagen and opened the driver's door. My stomach clenched when I saw Amanda get out of the car and hug the man. They headed for the hotel's awning, sometimes running, sometimes walking, exchanging laughs. Then he closed the umbrella and took the room key out of his pocket. I stood in the parking lot for more than 2 hours, and during that time, the rain stopped. I got out of the car only briefly. At that moment, they left the room and, still laughing, headed for their cars. Amanda gave the man a quick kiss on the cheek before getting into her car, a gesture intended for a husband rather than a lover. She didn't even notice my car parked on the other side of the parking lot, completely focused on her companion. Tears welled up in my eyes as I watched them drive away. I still needed to fix the air conditioner in the cottage buffet, but I couldn't bring myself to do it right then. It took less than an hour before I returned to the workshop, where I could try to distract myself from the pain. The boss was upset at first that I hadn't fixed the air conditioner, but his disappointment increased when I told him I was quitting. He didn't question me or ask for an explanation. After leaving the office, I went to the bank, cashed my severance check, and withdrew almost all the money from my accounts, leaving only $6,000. The savings account was for the purchase of a new house, and the money market account was for the girls' college education. While driving to Kutztown, I realized that Brenda would never go to college because of her poor grades and poor academic attitude. I couldn't figure out what I had done to make her turn against me, and I was too scared to talk to her about it. Brenda seemed to have more faith in her mother than in me. It was unclear how Colleen and Brenda, who were raised the same way, turned out to be so different. Despite feeling guilty, I quickly pushed it aside and paid for all 4 years of Colleen's college education. I felt relieved that I wouldn't have to worry about the dorm fees and meal plan because it was so close to home. Amanda greeted me when I arrived. I took off my wet shoes at the front door. She came out of the kitchen and asked why I came home so early, assuming I had to spend the whole day in Allentown. I walked past her into the bedroom and gave her a quick peck on the cheek, as she did with her lover. I didn't answer her question, and her expression clouded with confusion when I started packing my first bag. She came into the bedroom. "John, what's going on? What are you doing?" she asked. But I continued to pack my things without looking up. I took only the most necessary items: underwear, shoes, and work clothes. "Are you going to tell me what's going on? Why are you leaving?" she begged. "If you've had a hard day at work, it doesn't mean you have to leave," she added, disappointment in her voice. "Answer me, please. I'm your wife." I stopped for a moment and looked at her. She realized that it was not worth interrupting me or rushing things. "I didn't work in Allentown today," I said flawlessly, without hesitation or doubt. Amanda was silent, waiting for my next words. When I finished packing, I paused again and then added, "I was working in York today." It was another short, uncomplicated statement that I delivered flawlessly. As I was taking my shoes out of the closet, I saw my wife slip out of the room noiselessly without saying a word. She sat down on the sofa in the living room, and I went to the front door. I stopped briefly to put on my work boots and took one last look at her before leaving. There were tears in her eyes, but she calmly watched me go. There were no words of explanation, no remorse. As I was driving towards Hagerstown, the phone rang. Given the situation, it would be easier for me to communicate via messages, but just using a mobile phone was a victory for me. It was Colleen offering a helping hand. "Hi, Dad." "Hello. Are you in Hagerstown?" I replied. "Mom said you left, and I wanted to know how you were doing. Are you okay?" Colleen continued. "I'm fine, Dad. Do you need anything from me? Is there anything I can do to help?" "No." It's hard to have a meaningful conversation with someone when words just don't come out. I wanted so much to tell my daughter about a lot of things, but I couldn't find the courage. Mom shared with me and Brenda what happened. "I'm not happy with the current situation, but it makes me feel better that you know now," Colleen said. "Have you and Brenda been informed?" "For about 3 years now," the daughter replied. "I feel very stupid." "Dad, please don't do this to yourself. You are a wonderful father and husband." "Never doubt it," Colleen began to reassure me. I couldn't find the words to answer. The news was overwhelming. My stomach was cramping, but I had no appetite. "Dad, are you here? Are you okay?" "I'll be fine. And by the way, I've already paid for your school tuition. You're ready to enroll." "I don't care about that. I care about you." "Thanks, honey. I have to go." I abruptly turned off the phone before she could speak further. While having lunch at Cracker Barrel in Harrisonburg, I noticed a vacancy announcement for a room service manager specializing in air conditioning and heating. After a quick phone call, I was scheduled for an interview the next morning. As someone who had never been interviewed before, I felt a little nervous, especially considering my noticeable speech impediment. But I tried to remain optimistic. If I succeed, it will be wonderful. If not, it's okay. Oak Brook Meadows was a quaint church shelter for the elderly. The aging building seemed to have expanded chaotically over the years, lacking either integrity or organization. Many buildings were in dire need of renovation. "Good morning. You must be Mr. Tyson," the man greeted me, holding out his hand. "My name is Don Watson. Do you mind if I call you John?" "I don't mind," I nodded. We shook hands, and I sat down in an armchair. For the next half hour, Don Watson delved into the rich history of Oak Brook Meadows, shedding light on the complex details of this institution. My first impression was related to the financial aspect. Despite being a nonprofit organization, it faced funding problems to maintain its activities. More than 100 elderly people lived in the institution, and when they could no longer take care of themselves due to illness or age, they needed to be transferred to a government institution. The cost of outsourcing repairs and maintenance was so tight on their budget that they considered closing. Hiring a full-time service manager was a last desperate measure, but they had a hard time finding someone willing to accept a low salary. A small apartment in the basement of the main building and meals in the public dining room became an advantage for me to stay here to work. It took me 3 days of work to make the apartment habitable. The food was delicious. I had a feeling that everything would be fine. I was pleased with the fully equipped workshop with many manuals and spare parts. Although there were no problems with air conditioning and heating, I had little experience with dishwashers, stoves, and built-in refrigerators. There were difficulties with plumbing, but I coped with them. I spent the whole weekend researching the insurance policies of the facility, and although things progressed slowly at first, eventually everything fell into place. Having solved the urgent repair issues, I conducted a thorough inventory of items in need of maintenance. I strategically planned a combination of simple tasks and more complex projects to streamline my workload. Having set priorities, I established a daily routine that allowed me to effectively combine everyday responsibilities with landscaping tasks. After a few weeks, I entered into a comfortable schedule, doing business during the day and beautifying my living space in the evenings. I made sure that my mobile phone was charged but always kept it turned off. Instead, I relied on a landline phone for work and an old Windows 7 computer that I had set up for maintenance. Don was happy with my work, and I was generally happy with the situation. Life was getting better. It's been over 3 months since I left. On Colleen's birthday, I decided to call her. This was my first contact after I left. I was stunned that no one had tried to contact me, and I felt depressed that no one cared. "Colleen, it's Dad." "Happy birthday," I said. "Dad. I'm so glad to hear from you. Your phone is always off. Where are you and what are you doing?" "I'm worried about you," my daughter spoke quickly. "Calm down. One question at a time. I'm all right. I have a job and a place to live. I'm more concerned about how you're doing. How are your studies going?" "I live in a dorm with 2 other girls. I stick to my eating plan rather than going home to eat. I work part-time at a diner near campus. Do you need anything?" "No, it's okay. How are the others doing?" I decided to ask. "Not really. Mom, as expected, is not feeling very well. She told Brenda and me about what happened. I don't think she regrets what she did. She just regrets getting caught. She started working at Zena's diner, but I don't think she earns enough to feed her family. As a result, she sold all the tools and things from the garage and now sells furniture. The last time I talked to her, she mentioned that she was going to the bank to discuss mortgage payments. I'm afraid she might think about selling the house. It's a pity because it was a beautiful house. And here's another thing, Brenda is missing. After you left, she quarreled with her mother. For your information, you are not Brenda's biological father. Her real father is a man named Samuelson from Gettysburg. I think he's the same person Mom was dating the last time you were here. Brenda left and sent a postcard from San Francisco. It feels like I'm to blame for all these misfortunes, I said. No, Dad, it's not your fault. It's Mom's fault, my daughter began to reassure me. Colleen, could you give me your address? I want to send you a power of attorney so that it will be easier for your mother to sell the house. You don't have to do this, but it would be good for her, Colleen agreed. The staff did not eat with the residents of Oakbrook Meadows. They ate later and in another part of the dining room. By that time, I'd managed to make friends with the staff and some of the residents. Ivy James quickly became a familiar face at my dinner table. Despite my initial comparison that they were all here as prisoners, Ivy held an important position as a laundress in the institution and was responsible for laundry while most of the residents washed their clothes in the common room. I often repaired the washing machines or dryers due to their frequent malfunctions. Ivy, a woman in her late 40s, was a reliable and hard-working employee of the institution. She wasn't a stunning beauty, but she wasn't unattractive either. I found out that she was not married and had never tied the knot. She was diligent and seemed to be in decent physical shape. She lived with her parents, who drove her to and from work. What set her apart from the others and made me like her was that she couldn't hear well. I soon noticed that I was getting closer to Ivy. She wore a small notebook around her neck and used it to communicate when needed, but she usually got along fine without it. She was a very good lip reader, and for some reason, I didn't stutter when I was next to her. I didn't even have to say the words, I could just say them with my lips. It calmed me down a bit. She never made me feel uncomfortable about her illness. Our relationship improved when she invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family. Her parents and sister were not hard of hearing. Her mother and sister spoke the language of the deaf and dumb. Her father, who had a kind disposition, relied on the two women who translated for him. They were attentive to my stuttering and guided the conversation so that I felt included in it, but at the same time minimized my need to speak. It was a positive meeting, and Ivy and I became close. The Virginia School for the Deaf was conveniently located just 30 minutes away in Stonington, where I easily signed up for evening classes in sign language even in the middle of the semester. Although I didn't talk to Ivy directly about it, she noticed that something had changed when I began to closely follow her gestures. As soon as I told her about my intentions, she readily agreed to help me with my homework and even offered to stay behind to help. I was told at school that it would most likely take about 2 years to reach a level of language proficiency where I could have a basic conversation, but I was determined to start somewhere, and I was very interested. The progress I was making was satisfying, and although I had a semblance of a personal life, I wasn't actively dating anyone. With each passing day, the pain of my failed marriage gradually subsided. Colleen called and said she was coming to my place for Christmas. It was impossible to refuse. I had no trouble booking a guest room for her at Oakbrook Meadows. I was afraid that she would meet Ivy, but my fears turned out to be unfounded. Upon learning that Ivy was deaf, Colleen immediately began to gesture, although not very skillfully. In high school, Colleen studied 2 subjects which allowed her to get an advanced grade in college, where she studied special education in Kutztown. It was obvious that she and Ivy had a lot in common, as they could easily have long conversations without my participation. During the Christmas holidays, we spent most of our time with Ivy and her parents. Despite my constant stuttering, which seemed to never end even during the holidays, good old Dad didn't know anything about Colleen's academic success, but it was clear that she was on the way to great success. Colleen didn't seem to notice my periodic absences and even seemed to enjoy my discomfort when Ivy kissed me under the mistletoe. As she was preparing to leave, Colleen nonchalantly talked about Amanda's possible relationship with Jeff Samuelson. These were just small hints and comments, but Colleen seemed to hint at plans for the future, which she was looking forward to. 2 weeks later, everything fell into place. Amanda didn't ask for anything, she just wanted a divorce. I filled out all the paperwork and returned it to her lawyer, but one thing bothered me a lot. I was beside myself with rage. She manipulated me, exploited me, and then decided she could get rid of me when she got tired of me. It wasn't fair. I decided to leave her and initiated a divorce, but it still seemed unfair to me, and I wanted to achieve some kind of balance. Even though I was happy in my new life, I should have just admitted my failure and forgotten about it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Ivy didn't flaunt her happiness when I shared the news of the divorce, but I could tell that her mood lifted. She remained the same, but at the same time became even more beautiful. Restless nights haunted me. I constantly felt that I was being manipulated. My ego was hurt, and I felt hurt because of her mistakes. It was a typical scenario, but I couldn't help but be outraged. I needed to find a way to calm my emotions. At 6 o'clock on Monday morning, I was sitting at the Ugly Mug Cafe in Gettysburg, sipping coffee. I was waiting for Jeff Samuelson, whose work started at 7 o'clock in the morning. I made sure to dress well for the meeting with Mrs. Samuelson. When I arrived at their house and rang the doorbell, to my surprise, despite the early hour, she was already dressed and ready for work. "Hello, how can I help you?" she said when she saw me. "Mrs. Samuelson, I'm John Tyson." "I was hoping to talk to you," I replied. "Are you advertising some kind of product, Mr. Tyson?" "I don't think we're interested in that." "No, this is a personal matter concerning your husband and my wife." She paused, lost in thought. I couldn't figure out if she wanted to ask me to leave or invite me into the house. "Is your wife's name Amanda by any chance?" "Yes, that's right." "Please come in, Mr. Tyson. We really need to talk." Over the next 2 hours, Marie Samuelson and I discussed various things. When I left her house, I couldn't tell if I was relieved or worried. She had suspected something for a long time but could not find solid evidence. She remained calm and collected until I mentioned Brenda, then her behavior changed, and I realized that it was time for me to leave. My intention was fulfilled. When I got back, the first thing I did was tell Ivy everything. It was important to me that our relationship began with complete honesty and transparency. Ivy was sympathetic and took the time to comfort me. When everything was back to normal, we worked on the house together. Although we were too old to have children of our own, Ivy showed an interest in adoption. After examining our capabilities, we found that the chances of adopting children with hearing impairments are quite high. Staunton school staff readily helped us in this process. "Dad, this is Colleen," Colleen suddenly called. I was surprised to receive a call from my daughter in the middle of the night. "Hi, is everything okay?" I was worried. "Unfortunately, not really. But don't worry. I am at Baptist Hospital in York. Mom was shot, her condition is stable, but I thought I should let you know," my daughter told me. "Okay, now I'm interested in you. What happened?" "As far as I know, Mom and Mr. Samuelson were having dinner at Cracker Barrel when Mrs. Samuelson came in and shot them with a .22 caliber revolver. Fortunately, she didn't get hit, except for one shot that grazed Mom's right arm. Although the injury turned out to be minor, she needed medical attention, and she will be discharged in a few hours. I'll stay with her until then and then I'll take her home." As for her boyfriend, he was not injured but mysteriously disappeared before the police arrived at the scene. He left my mom. Mrs. Samuelson remained where she was, patiently waiting for the police to arrive. "I don't see the need to stay. I'll take her home. I'll call you later. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Mom is furious that he left her. I've never seen her so angry," Colleen finished. "Thank you for informing me. Oh, and try to find some free time in early April, your father is getting married. Congratulations. I will definitely come. I'm not going to tell my mom about this, it's going to upset her very much right now. Bye." After finishing the conversation, I realized that I had to inform Ivy about the upcoming wedding. So ended the story of a restrained, calculating man. I bought a house and moved in with a new wife, adopting 3 children and raising many others. Colleen found a teaching position at a school for the deaf in Virginia and tied the knot a year later. I continued to work at Oakbrook Meadows, and Ivy chose a different path. Meanwhile, Amanda continues to devote herself to working at the diner. As for Jeff Samuelson, he disappeared without a trace. Story 2. We had a pretty average family, nothing particularly remarkable about us. My wife Margaret and I were raising our daughter, who was about to finish school and get ready for prom. I worked as a truck driver, mainly transporting tanker trucks with gasoline. My brother also worked in the same company as me, driving tankers. He lived not far from us, just a couple of houses down the street. For a while, Maggie worked as a dispatcher, but she got tired of it and decided to focus on being a homemaker. Especially since I started going on trips more often lately, and the yard wasn't taking care of itself. Occasionally, she'd join me on trips when things were relatively calm at home, offering her company for entertainment on the road. This spring, when I had a few days off and was catching up on household chores, our daughter rushed into the yard looking worried and came straight to me. I was working on repairing our old lawnmower but set aside my tools upon seeing Amanda's anxious face. "What's wrong, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost," I asked immediately. "Dad, there's a guy lying on the street. I don't even know if he's alive. He's just lying there, not moving." I called out to him, but he's not responding. At first, I thought it might just be one of the local youngsters who hadn't made it home after a night out. But even if that were the case, I couldn't just stand aside. I decided to at least check if the person was alive and, if necessary, call the police. My daughter and I went out to the yard. I walked a little ahead while she directed me. The guy was lying at the end of our yard, almost hidden in the tall grass near the fence. I approached him and called out. When he didn't respond, I moved closer. There were quite a few scrapes and bruises all over the guy's body and face. I tried to feel for a pulse, and he was still alive. So, I gently shook his shoulder, and soon, he let out a weak groan. "Hey, buddy. How did you end up here?" I asked him when he lifted his head slightly and tried to look around. "What? Where am I?" he murmured. He didn't smell of alcohol, and I realized the guy had just ended up in an unpleasant situation. Asking my daughter to help me, I managed to lift him as best as I could, and we dragged him into the yard. We sat him down on a bench, and I asked my daughter to bring some water and the first aid kit. By that time, the stranger had started to come to a bit and even attempted to adjust his torn clothes. "How are you feeling?" I asked when he had quenched his thirst a little. "Thanks. I'm better." "Who are you? How did I end up here?" "Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Do you remember what happened to you? Who beat you up?" The guy lowered his head, put his hand to his temple, and groaned again. At that moment, Margaret came out to us. Seeing the poor guy, she immediately started fretting, came over with a caring look, and began asking what had happened. While I explained the situation to my wife, the guy started feeling a bit better and tried to get up to leave our yard, but he recoiled and sat back down on the bench. "Oh God, he's completely weak," Margaret said. "Just look at him, he's still so young. He needs to lie down. Mandy, go prepare the couch, and I'll heat up some soup for him." "Meg, what are you talking about? He's a stranger. We should call the police. We don't know what happened to him." I protested slightly. "No, everything's fine. No need for the police." "Please," the guy interjected. I also started feeling sorry for him, and I agreed with my wife that we should first get him sorted out a bit, and then report to the police. We took him into the house, where I treated some of his wounds, and my wife made sure he had something to eat. Later on, I started questioning him again about who he was and where he came from. The guy introduced himself as Matt. But when asked about the rest, he replied that he couldn't remember anything and had a terrible headache. He looked to be about 18 to 20 years old. Oddly enough, he couldn't recall his exact age, and he had no documents on him. It was hard to determine much from his clothing since it was as dirty and torn as he was. He stayed with us for about an hour, during which my daughter managed to strike up a conversation with him. I spoke with my wife again and convinced her that we should take him to the hospital and report as necessary. Matt somehow really appealed to Maggie, and she didn't want to let him go, but I explained to her that he wasn't like a stray dog you could just keep at home. Soon, I drove him to the local hospital. There, I had quite a bit to deal with. I had to fill out several forms, and when the police arrived, they conducted what felt like a full-on interrogation. For a moment, I even regretted getting involved in this. But Matt was someone in need of help, and I couldn't just leave him on the streets. The next day, the hospital called and informed us that Matt was feeling much better. However, since he had nowhere to go, they suggested we take him back. Margaret seemed oddly pleased with this suggestion, but I argued with her for a while about whether it was wise to shelter someone completely unknown to us. After all, he might turn out to be a criminal. The police didn't find anything on him, but I couldn't shake off my concerns. In the end, Margaret, joined by our daughter, persuaded me to shelter the poor guy for the time being. I don't even know what made them so sympathetic towards him, but I can say that they've always been kind and compassionate, so maybe that was the main reason for their desire. I went to the hospital, but before taking him home, I had a conversation with him, making it clear that my wife and daughter mean everything to me, and I wouldn't tolerate any harm coming to them. Matt swore he meant no harm. On the contrary, he was even willing to help us with chores in return for our care and food. I agreed to let him stay with us until I went on another trip or until the police managed to identify him. Upon arriving home, I saw that my brother had returned from his business trip and dropped by. Seeing Matt next to me, he immediately began examining him and asking questions. By that time, Maggie had already told him about the situation and how sorry she felt for the poor guy. Edward was more curious than anything. He had never been particularly friendly. His questioning even seemed a bit harsh to me. However, during all this time, the guy hadn't shown any sign of misconduct and behaved politely and gratefully. Several days had passed since this mysterious guy moved into our house. The next day, I had to take him to the doctor for a checkup as there hadn't been any progress in his memory. Matt mentioned that he occasionally had some fleeting glimpses, but nothing terrible in his visions. Moreover, he turned out to be a fairly hard-working guy. I even began to think he might have lived on a farm before, and he already had a few calluses on his hands, although they weren't very noticeable. Maggie took it upon herself to sew him some of my old shirts and pants since he was smaller than me. And Amanda had become quite close to him, taking him out for a walk with her school friends a couple of times. Even I had started to get used to this guy. There was something genuinely captivating about him. One morning, I woke up to someone shouting loudly in the house. I rushed to the sound and saw Matt in the kitchen, holding his head while Margaret, in her robe, was fussing over him, and Amanda had also come to see what had happened. "What's going on here?" I asked when I entered. "John, why are you hesitating?" "He's not feeling well." "Start the car, we need to take him to the hospital," my wife babbled. I didn't waste time and quickly got dressed, preparing the car. My wife helped Matt to the car, but by that time, he had calmed down a bit and pleaded not to go to the hospital, saying he felt better. "No, Matt, you sit. It's better to get yourself checked," I replied. I didn't want him to have some kind of seizure, as while he was staying with us, in a way, we were responsible for him. On the way to the hospital, I frequently glanced at him through the rearview mirror and noticed that he looked perfectly healthy, and there was no trace of the morning attack. Nevertheless, I took him to the doctor, and they kept Matt there for a day for a more comprehensive examination. Since it wasn't known whether he had insurance, I had to pay for all the medical expenses. When I got back home, my wife wouldn't stop bombarding me with questions about Matt and what was going on with him. And that's when I noticed Margaret wasn't just caring for the guy, but giving him way too much attention. Her almost naked appearance in the morning, hovering over him, somehow got stuck in my head, and I asked my wife why she came out to Matt like that. "I just went to get some water." You know, half asleep, I completely forgot we had another person in the house. And there he was, sitting and groaning, holding his head. Was I supposed to leave him and go change? Come on, John, you're not at the age to be jealous. Besides, of whom? He's almost like a son to me. My wife's response seemed logical to me, but then I noticed Amanda was nowhere to be seen. She didn't have to go to school today, and when I asked my wife where our daughter was, she said Amanda had left somewhere shortly after I took Matt to the hospital. Later, I busied myself with my usual household chores, but since then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in our family. I began recalling all the events to try to understand what might have gone wrong and at what moment. But nothing came to mind yet. Soon Edward visited us again, and after inquiring about our affairs, he suggested just sitting down with beer. "Today's a holiday. And you're still tinkering with tools," he said. "Let's go." "Actually, bro, I wanted to talk to you. I even brought beer, come on." We went to the gazebo, settled at a small table, and at first, my brother briefed me on his visit to the office the day before, mentioning a trip for both of us in a few days. "But actually, I wanted to ask you about that lad. Noticed he's missing. Did you send him home? Has he finally remembered everything?" "No. He had a seizure. He's still in the hospital. Maybe that's for the best. Have you gone to the police? Maybe they dug something up on him? I'm asking because he seems suspicious to me. He came to everything ready to go, pretending to be innocent. You see him every day." Did you notice anything strange? Listen, Ed. If you know something, don't beat around the bush. Speak up, as it is. Your riddles sometimes get on my nerves. My brother approached everything cautiously, but sometimes I felt he was overdoing it. It's nothing. I don't want to say anything like that. It's just that from my perspective, I see how he behaves. I noticed your daughter seems to have fallen for this lad. And you know what that could lead to? Forget it, they're just friends. Let's suppose. But what will you do when she ends up pregnant by him? What will you tell Margaret then? And Maggie herself. What about Maggie? I love my brother, but his insinuations were starting to annoy me a bit. Nothing, he replied as if offended. If I were in your place, I wouldn't allow my wife to get so close to him. Still, my brother didn't say anything specific, maybe because he had no evidence, or maybe because Margaret appeared at that moment, walking towards us. It seemed she might have overheard Edward's last words, as she stayed to chat with us later. However, despite his efforts, my brother managed to sow some doubts in me. I decided that when Matt was released from the hospital, I'd pay more attention to him and my wife. And I also decided to heed his advice and visit the station again to check information about Matt. 24 hours later, Matt was walking in our house again. My wife was glad he was fine, as the test results showed no abnormalities, and the doctor said the headache attack might have been triggered by emerging memories. Our life continued as usual. However, I started paying closer attention to our guest. But most of all, I was worried that Amanda had become somewhat gloomy since then and tried to communicate less with Matt. Even my inquiries about what had happened to her yielded nothing. She just said she had a disagreement with a friend at school. The day came when my brother and I were supposed to set off. I didn't want to leave Matt alone at home with my wife and daughter. So, I invited him to come with me, travel around cities, along the roads, perhaps he might remember something else. Matt agreed without much persuasion, and we started preparing for the trip. When almost everything was ready, Margaret came up to me and said she also wanted to go with me this time. Why? Everything's fine at home. The neighbor will look after Amanda if anything happens. And besides, we recently talked about how in one of the upcoming trips, I'll ride with you again, she said. I didn't particularly want her to go with us this time, especially since her insistence seemed a bit suspicious to me, and immediately my brother's words came to mind about my wife being too involved with Matt. However, I decided that now they would both be with me almost all the time, and I would definitely notice if there was something between them or if these were just foolish suspicions. Several hours had already passed on our journey. The cabin in my car was huge, with a spacious sleeping area in the back, capable of accommodating 3 more people besides the 3 of us. I was driving ahead, while my brother was behind in his tanker. Sometimes, we'd communicate over the radio, and other times, we'd simply stop briefly. In the evening, during one of our stops when I went to the kiosk to get some food, our neighbor called me. She said she couldn't reach Margaret, so she dialed my number instead. The neighbor's voice sounded a bit alarmed, and when I inquired about what had happened, she mentioned that our daughter Amanda had organized a small gathering at home that same evening. However, the neighbor's concern wasn't about that. She told me that when she visited Amanda, she saw that the girl was very drunk. I was taken aback by our neighbor's words. I felt the urge to turn back and figure out what was going on because our daughter had never done something like this before. However, on the other hand, we had already traveled quite far, and the cargo needed to be delivered on time. We were promised good money for this trip. I immediately dialed my daughter's number, and when she picked up, her speech was barely coherent. "Daughter, what's going on there? What's with the drinking? Don't you realize I'm at work? I shouldn't have brought your mother along." "Oh, Dad. I don't care about her. And anyway." She cut me off. "You both just don't understand what I'm feeling. You think about your work, and she, eek, that one who calls herself my mother. Do you even know what she's been up to? Why do you think I got so drunk? So, she can do whatever she wants, but I can't? Daughter, what are you talking about?" I couldn't grasp what she was trying to tell me. "You're just a blind old man if you haven't noticed she's tumbling around with this Matt. Eek. Ha ha. Damn, what a family." the phone started beeping. I tried calling my daughter again, but she didn't pick up. So, I called the neighbor back and asked her to keep a closer eye on Amanda that evening, even to the extent of staying at our place. My thoughts were all over the place. I was about to head back to the car, fully intending to turn back, and at that moment, I couldn't care less about the money. My daughter was more important. Yet her words kept echoing in my head, and I desperately hoped it was just her drunken fantasies. As I approached the car, my brother was coming towards me. He noticed my concerned expression and started asking. I briefly explained what had happened and that I was planning to return. But he tried to persuade me, saying it could be sorted out easily and that it would be better to put Margaret on a bus and let her deal with the situation herself. No, bro. I can't do that. Besides, I froze in place as we almost reached the car. It was dark outside, but the streetlight slightly illuminated the car, and I could see two figures embracing inside the cabin. At that moment, they seemed to have noticed us and returned to more modest sitting positions. "Oh, you scoundrel. So, it's all true?" I muttered and rushed to the cabin. Edward apparently noticed the same thing I did. He followed me. I quickly got into the cabin, grabbed the little scoundrel by the ear, and started dragging him out of the cabin. "So, it's true? You're fucking around with this little scoundrel?" I asked my wife on the go. "John. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," she replied fearfully. She realized they had been caught in such a foolish moment, and at that moment, she had no suitable words for justification. I pushed Matt out of the cabin. Edward was there below to prevent him from escaping, and when I jumped out after him, I grabbed him again and started roughing him up. My brother stood nearby but didn't hit him. He just gave me the chance to unleash my anger, and only occasionally, when Matt tried to defend himself or escape, Edward intervened, not giving the scoundrel any chances. Finally, when Matt's face resembled the day I found him, I felt a bit relieved, and I didn't really want to kill him. "Get out of here, you puppy!" I shouted, and only then did he limp away from the parking lot towards the road. "And you're just letting him go?" my brother asked when Matt disappeared into the darkness. "Damn him. I have more important things to do right now. Listen, bro. You go ahead. Try to explain on the spot that I'll be a bit late. I need to get to my daughter." Brother watched me as I dived into the cabin again and started the engine. Margaret huddled in the corner of the seat, afraid to utter a word. Perhaps it was for the best at that moment, as I didn't want to talk to her then, though there was a desire to push her out of the car and send her after that little bastard. I drove all night on the highway, trying to get home as fast as possible. Periodically, I tried calling my daughter, but she didn't pick up. Only the call to the neighbor calmed me a little when she said the party ended quite quickly and Amanda had collapsed into sleep. "What's wrong with her?" "Something with Amanda?" my wife asked when I finished talking to the neighbor. "Oh, now you remember our daughter? Have you even called her once tonight? Asked how she's doing? What she's up to? Or did that scoundrel fill your head so much that you couldn't notice anything else?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. Dawn was approaching, and I started feeling sleepy. To avoid an accident, especially since my tanker was filled with gasoline, I turned onto a dirt road, drove a little further, and stopped to get an hour of sleep. I ordered my wife to wake me up soon. She had managed to rest a bit during the night. It seemed like she was completely unconcerned about everything that had happened. Personally, I didn't want to fall asleep. I wanted to get home as soon as possible. But as soon as I stopped the car and leaned towards the wheel, I immediately shut down. A little later, I felt someone nudging me. I opened my eyes and saw some guy on the cabin step. I didn't understand what was happening, looked around, and noticed that the sun was already high, and Margaret was not in the car. "Hey, man, thank God. You're alive." "I thought something had happened," the guy said. "Who are you?" I asked. "I'm a truck driver." I was passing by, saw the tanker parked strangely. So, I decided to check. I thanked the guy for his concern, exchanged a few more words with him, and when he left, I carefully inspected the cabin. There was a note on the seat where my wife was sitting. "John, I'm sorry, but I'm guilty before you. I don't know what came over me. This guy was so charming. I don't even understand how I agreed to be with him. I'm leaving. I don't even know where to, but I need time. And so do you. I don't know when I'll be able to come back. I hope you can forgive me. What silly women. I nervously tossed the note back onto the seat. It was clear there was no point in looking for my wife, and I didn't want to, after she had betrayed me so cruelly. The clock showed 11:30, and I started the engine to head home. The journey seemed endlessly long to me, even though there wasn't much left. On the way, I called the neighbor again, asking about the situation at home. She replied that Amanda was suffering from a terrible hangover and vaguely remembered the last hours of the party. I was grateful to the neighbor for showing such care and continued driving in a slightly calmer state. When I arrived home, I saw a rather unpleasant scene. No one had cleaned up after the party, and the house looked more like a homeless shelter. When my daughter saw me, she shyly lowered her gaze and didn't dare speak first. Amanda, our conversation yesterday really worried me. Can you explain to me why you did that? You're a grown-up girl to me. I trusted you. Dad, she sobbed. I'm sorry. I just couldn't handle it anymore. This Matt. Did he do something to you? I asked, concerned. No. Well, it seemed like we started dating, but we didn't want to tell you. I know how you would react to that. And then that day when he supposedly had an attack. I saw them when they were in the kitchen. But they noticed me, and Matt pretended he had a headache. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you everything right away, but Mom threatened that I wouldn't have a graduation if I blabbed. Oh, God. I hugged my daughter, realizing that for the first time in her life, she had encountered such betrayal, especially from her mother. I didn't scold her because, essentially, she wasn't guilty of anything, except allowing herself to fall in love with that stranger. Later, Amanda asked where Mother and Matt were and why they didn't come back with me. I explained everything to her as best as I could, trying not to darken my speech too much. Regarding Matt, my daughter was even glad that he had left our lives. But the news about her mother saddened her a bit. Later, I called my brother and said I could leave the next morning. This time, I planned to take my daughter with me. After all, there was no one at home to look after her, even though she promised she wouldn't throw parties anymore. But I was more worried that while she was alone, our home might be visited by Matt since he knew our address and could easily return. Then, to think less about the bad, my daughter and I started cleaning, and in the evening, she packed her backpack so as not to waste time in the morning. At night, I woke up because I heard some sounds in the house. At first, I thought it could be Amanda, but a worrying feeling started to rise inside me, and I decided to go check just in case. First, I peeked into my daughter's room to understand if she was the one making noise downstairs. But Amanda was fast asleep in her bed, and I realized there was an intruder in the house. I returned to the bedroom and took a baseball bat from there. Armed like this, I began to sneak through the corridor to check who dared to enter our home. Even from a distance, I noticed a night light in the living room, and I carefully peeked around the corner. There I saw Matt searching for something in the cupboard. Anger filled me again, and this time, I was even ready to kill the scoundrel who had destroyed my family. I silently approached him and swung the bat. But apparently, he noticed my reflection in the cupboard door and immediately jumped aside. "What are you doing here?" I asked when he turned to me. "What?" "I actually live here." "Oh, you scoundrel. Have you completely lost your mind? Who the hell do you think you are?" I swung the bat again, but Matt dodged, and I ended up breaking the glass. I continued to chase him, sometimes hitting his skinny body, which made him yelp, but for some reason, he kept throwing sarcastic remarks that irritated me even more. Amanda appeared due to the noise we created. She screamed in horror when she saw Matt again, now with an even more beaten-up face. "Oh, there's a bun coming out." "What? Didn't want to share me with Mommy?" Matt chuckled. At that moment, I managed to hit him in the face so hard that he fell to the floor motionless. For a moment, it seemed to me that I had killed him with my blow. Carefully feeling for a pulse, I made sure he was still alive and hurried to comfort my daughter. "Don't worry, darling. It's all over now. I'll call the police, and he won't bother us for a long time," I said, putting the bat away and hugging my daughter to calm her trembling from the excitement. I wanted to take her to the kitchen to wait there, but when we turned, I saw that Matt was no longer on the floor. Then I heard rustling in the hallway and rushed there. Matt was already at the door, demonstratively shaking the keys to my car. "What? Thought you could leave me with nothing? By the way, your wife isn't that great in bed. I don't even know what you saw in her," he said, then dashed out onto the street. I immediately ran after him, but despite being so beaten up, he quickly reached the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I couldn't stop the truck, so I had to retreat. Returning home, I first checked on my daughter, and then immediately called the police, reported the truck theft, and that Matt turned out to be a criminal. The police arrived at our house fairly quickly. I told the investigator everything in detail and didn't hide the fact that Matt seduced my wife, and now she has disappeared, leaving only a farewell note. "By the way, about your wife," said the policeman. "Literally recently, we received information that in a neighboring town, a woman resembling Margaret was arrested. She was trying to steal food from a cafe. One waitress caught her. I can give you the address of the station. You can go and get her." The policeman's words shocked me a bit. I expected anything from my wife, even her going to search for Matt. But stealing food? How low can this chicken fall? It's like her memory was wiped, not Matt's, but hers. In the morning, I called the boss and explained about the trouble with the car. Thankfully, the cargo and the car itself were insured, and I only got a reprimand for not continuing my journey and returning back. But that didn't scare me as much as what was happening with my family now. I decided not to go immediately for my wife. After getting the phone number of the police station from the officer, I called and said I could come only in a couple of days, asking them not to release Margaret anywhere until then. I wanted her to spend some time in the slammer and feel the consequences of the life she chose over her family. A couple of hours later, our policeman contacted me again and said they found the car. However, he had some unpleasant news for me. They found the car so quickly due to a huge explosion near the city as a result of an accident. In the cabin, they found a charred body. Preliminary results suggested it was a young man. I didn't go to the accident site. I no longer felt sorry for that guy whom I had pitted not long ago. I only regretted the car that I had grown used to. He also mentioned that they managed to find out that this guy actually lived in another town on a farm. Things didn't work out for him there, and after another fight with friends, they decided to drop him off elsewhere. Somehow, the police discovered that he wasn't suffering memory loss at all. He was pretending to be that way to gain sympathy and have a place to stay. It turned out he had pulled off such tricks before, as witnesses revealed during the questioning. But for some reason, no one had filed a complaint against him with the police yet. A couple of days later, I had to go to the place where Margaret was arrested. No matter how repulsive it was to see her again, I had to pick her up. Of course, I couldn't feel the same way about her as before. But we had spent many years together, and before this incident, I hadn't noticed her cheating on me. Besides, Amanda still needed a mother's love, even though she was angry with her. Our relationship remained strained for a long time, but with each passing day and her continuous pleas for forgiveness, I felt my anger gradually fading, and I decided to give her another chance.